Ukraine is the most armed country in Europe now, and China is getting bigger and bigger. So West is arming Ukraine, but we don't know what the goal is. The West has to draw two red lines. Stop the escalation before Putin is in a corner to use nuclear weapons.
Bonjour, Dr Heinz Gärtner. Pouvez-vous vous présenter?
Hi, I'm Heinz Gärtner, university professor here and teaching here at the University of Vienna, but I'm also a member of the International Institute for Peace, and I had several research and teaching positions abroad in the US and elsewhere.
Quelle est votre analyse de l'origine du conflit en Ukraine?
It is more or less a geopolitical conflict. Russia was considered to be part of a great power competition, like the US strategists would call it. Some would call it multipolarity. But Russia was about to lose this great power competition. Economically, Russia was very weak anyway. And then, of course, there was the NATO expansion in the West. And there was the Belt and Road Initiative by China coming closer and closer to Russia. So Russia was squeezed between the other big powers, because great power competition is considered the great power competition between US, China, and Russia. And Russia wanted to stay in this competition, and it wanted to keep its position, at least to get some more room of maneuver in the West. And that's why Russia, President Putin thought a war would be the only means to get some more space in Ukraine and in the West. However, it was one of the worst geopolitical decisions he could have made, because now NATO is everywhere. So NATO is now permanent in Poland, the Baltic states, not on a rotating basis. Ukraine is the most armed country in Europe now, and China is getting bigger and bigger. So Russia is now about to lose the great power competition because Putin's decision to go to war. So it was definitely the wrong decision. But anyway, he did not have the means, as many in the West would think that he has. Maybe he had imperial ambitions, but he didn't have the military means to do so. So when he invaded Ukraine, first of all, his military expenditures were only 6% of those of NATO, so no way that he could attack NATO. Secondly, he did not increase his military expenditures before the war. So they remained the same since 2016. Even there was also a reduction after 2016. So they were pretty low. Usually, if you want to start an imperial war, you increase your military budget years before. So they didn't do it. And he invaded Ukraine with 180,000 soldiers. So compare this, what the US did in Kuwait in 1991. So they liberated Kuwait from Iraq with 800,000 troops, and Kuwait is 40 times smaller than Ukraine. So it was a real military and geopolitical blunder by Putin, but he could never have had maybe implemented imperial ambitions expanding beyond Ukraine. So I think that's not a real analysis. It was a geopolitical setup.
L'Union européenne s'est fortement mobilisée pour soutenir l'Ukraine. Quelle est la position de l'Autriche?
Austria is a neutral state, and Austria of course, is not allowed to send directly arms to parties which are in military conflict. So neutral states should not send arms to war-fighting parties. However, what Austria is doing is sending humanitarian aid. Austria is the first in the European Union when it comes to humanitarian aid. However, neutral states should keep contact with all of the conflicting parties. So if these conflicting parties cannot talk to each other, neutral states should be able to talk to both of them, and the neutral state should be a mediator. So the Austrian Chancellor Nehammer tried to do it. He was too weak. He was too much under pressure. So he could not really do what a neutral state is supposed to do. But Austria now is moving, not really implementing yet, concept of neutrality, which I call the engaged neutrality. Engaged neutrality does not mean stay outside of everywhere, but getting involved. That means they can raise their voice if there is a war, if there is a genocide, if there are massive human rights violations. But the neutral states should not join an alliance and should not participate in foreign wars and deploy permanent troops. So Austria could, of course, provide a meeting place, mediation, if the time comes. The time is not here yet because the war fighting parties, they want to win more on the battlefield, so that's unfortunate. But neutral states, basically neutral or non-aligned state, it can be some non-aligned state in the global south as well, should provide the basis for future maybe peace talks, or at least talks, stability talks in Europe. So what I'm saying is not so much what Austria is doing, but what Austria should do as a neutral state. And what, of course, Austria is not allowed to do is to getting directly involved with weapons or soldiers in the military conflict of other parties.
Les États-Unis et de nombreux pays européens renforcent leur aide militaire en livrant des munitions, des missiles à longue portée, des chars lourds, des avions de combat et plus récemment des armes à sous-munitions. Pensez-vous que nous devrions continuer à armer l'Ukraine? Craignez-vous une escalade?
There has to be some proportionality. So always in war, there has to be some goals you want to achieve if you have some party, if you have an ally. I don't see the goals of the West yet. So the West is arming Ukraine, but we don't know what the goal is. Liberating all of Ukraine, bringing Russia to the negotiating table, or do damage to Russia, or ruin Russia. We don't know. So just arming without proportionality and without clear aims might be dangerous, and there is, of course, the danger that it might escalate on the one hand to Russia proper. It's possible that the Ukraine might use the weapons in order to attack at least some parts of Russia, and then Russia would definitely react with stronger means, maybe also on a NATO, with an attack on a NATO country. On the other hand, it's possible that the war and the fighting moves to, accidentally or not, to a NATO country like Poland. And we see that, of course, now the tensions between the on the border between Poland and Belarus, and so there is, of course, the possibility of escalation to a NATO country. If that is happen, NATO might invoke Article 5. That means all NATO countries might have to come to the aid to the country which is attacked. And all these setups or constellations have the inherent danger to escalate to an open-ended war, an open war, which means an world war. So arming has to be limited, and there have to be clear goals, but I don't see them yet.
Pensez-vous que l'Ukraine a les moyens de reconquérir les territoires annexés? Avez-vous des informations sur la situation militaire actuelle?
I don't think Ukraine has the means. I don't think delivering the F-16 fighter jets would make a difference. I don't even think that the cluster munition will make a great difference. So on the battlefield, there are not definite changes, no big changes. So some square kilometers here, some square kilometers there. If Ukraine really wants to liberate all the territory, the occupied parts of their country, it needs much more manpower. So, and usually you have, if you want to reconquer occupied territory, you have to have at least 5 times as much the manpower the occupiers has. And Ukraine doesn't have this manpower. So Ukraine needs manpower from other countries. So it would be very dangerous if NATO would provide these soldiers, this manpower. So that, of course, would be, NATO is directly involved in the war, and that would be definitely also this situation of a new world war, because then we have NATO against Russia. We have 2 nuclear powers fighting against each other on Ukraine territory. So Ukraine does not have the means. There are some considerations which I think are also dangerous. That some NATO countries like Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, they would build the coalition of the willing and send troops to Ukraine. But it's very likely that Russia would consider this as NATO troops as such and escalate the war. So what I see is an end of the conflict where the armies stand. The armies, we know this from history, we know this from the Korean War, we know this from the Cold War, we know this from the divided Germany. Where the armies are, there will be a dividing line and there will be an iron curtain. And there will be an iron curtain going through Ukraine, but starting in the Arctic. Finland, Sweden are now on the western part, Belarus on the eastern part, and it will go down to the Black Sea, and there will be a cordon sanitaire and an iron curtain, pretty like we had during the Cold War. So tensions will build up on both sides, even some mutual nuclear threats. So that will be the result of the war. So I do not see really a possibility with military means that Ukraine can liberate all its territory, including Donbass and Crimea, with military means.
Vladimir Poutine brandit régulièrement la menace nucléaire. Faut-il prendre ce risque au sérieux?
Yes, we should take it seriously. It's not only a bluff. And if there's a hypothetical possibility that Ukraine, and with the help of the West, would really push out all the Russian troops, Russia and Putin would not hesitate at least to threaten, but also maybe use what we call tactical nuclear weapons. And that, of course, has the danger of escalation, because there is no real study that would convincingly prove that the use of nuclear weapon can be limited. So there is always this escalation, and President Putin, of course, not only threatened with tactical, called smaller, which are not really small, but smaller nuclear weapons, but also he tested new intercontinental missiles. That means I always can also escalate to Washington. So the West has to draw 2 red lines. Stop the escalation before Putin is in a corner to use nuclear weapons. And second, stop the escalation that troops from NATO countries would be involved in the battlefields. These are 2 situations which are very, very dangerous. of course, nuclear weapons are designed as war-fighting weapons. So that's not only for Russia, that's only as well for the US. So they make him more usable. And they might think, oh, they're small enough, they're limited to Ukraine territory. So they might be seduced to use these weapons. And I think that's a real big danger. And there have to be some red lines before that. They have to find a way to the negotiation table before that. So that's not accidental that Putin threats or refers to nuclear weapons. So it's a danger.
Vous venez d'écrire un livre intitulé « L'Ukraine en guerre, la paix est-elle possible ?» Quels scénarios envisagez-vous?
So the book is a real pluralistic book. So I have authors which express and represent very different opinions. So it's very, very broad. So there are those who say the West has to have all of course criticize the invasion. So they all say that's not a thing of self-defense, what Putin claimed at the beginning. But the strategies are very different. So there's those who would say the West has to win the war no matter what. And on the other side, there have to be immediate peace negotiations. So this is the broad spectrum. My own chapter builds upon this idea, which I already had in March 3, 2014. That was before the invasion of Crimea, where I published it in a paper here in Austria. Actually, no international paper would publish it at that time. It was not an issue. So my idea was Ukraine should look at the Austrian model of neutrality in order to avoid a war. So neutrality would have been a means to, of course we cannot be sure, but it was not right either. Neutrality, that means Ukraine would have got back its territorial integrity and sovereignty because Austria became neutral in 1955 and all the foreign troops would leave, including the Soviet troops. And of course there was already these activities of Russian militias in the east. So they would have to leave, but Ukraine would have to pledge, based on international law, not to join NATO. So that's would be, and my conclusion was either Ukraine, that was in March 2014, either Ukraine would become permanent neutral or it will become permanent divided, like Germany or Korea. So neutrality was discarded, was dismissed several times. It was on the table in March 2022 when there have been negotiations. There was still neutrality on the negotiation tables. So these talks failed, we know. And now we have the result will be my second prediction, permanent division. So where the army stands, and Ukraine will not get immediately back the territorial integrity. But neutrality is still, I think, an option maybe after the war on the negotiation table, like, for example, Switzerland and Belgium got its neutrality after the Napoleonic Wars after 1815. There was the Vienna Congress, there was the huge Congress about the new European order, and then also neutrality emerged. That's the only possibility, what I see, that neutrality might still be an option, but more likely is that we have a Korean situation of division where the army stands and a ceasefire, but not a peace treaty, and then we have to deal with the situation. Yeah.
Je vous remercie, Dr. Heinz Gärtner, pour cette interview.
You're welcome.